Do you think at this point Zelensky and Ukraine will finally order military personnel to fall back? Or are they going to dig in and hold out to the very end because this particular battle has become so publicized in the media?
Well, first of all, everyone is mired in this giant sea of mud in eastern Ukraine. Until the mud dries, the moisture ends, and you get hard ground, there will be no major troop movements of any kind. I think the notion of a Ukrainian offensive in April, unless there is a miracle, the sun comes out and stays out 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and dries out the soil, they really cannot commit large ground forces, especially all these new tanks that they claim they're going to have, along with anything else, frankly, that moves on the ground. So right now, everyone is stuck with the sea of mud. Secondly, we now know from remarks made by Prigozhin, the man who heads up this thing called the Wagner Group, which is about a 35,000 man professional military organization committed to Russian national interests, has historically operated overseas, primarily not inside Russia, but because of the wars in Russia. He's made it very clear that General Surovikin, who was the man that was brought in late summer, early fall to sort of reorganize the Russian chain of command, reorganize the forces, begin assimilating the reservists and so forth, that he from the very beginning recognized that Bakhmut would be a very useful device to encourage the Ukrainians to commit forces in great numbers to it. Bakhmut has always been very important. This is the second point. It's always been a hub for rail lines, roads, communications, warehouses, factories, all of which have military utility. The fear in Kyiv has always been, if we lose Bakhmut, then the keystone in the edifice of the defense of the Donbass is gone. It will be very hard to maintain the lines of defense that they currently have once Bakhmut is out of their possession. The Russians could have seized this place much earlier. And what we now know, it was a deliberate decision not to do so. Let the Ukrainians occupy it and let them bring in tens of thousands of soldiers that then could be converted to corpses. And this is very, very frankly what's happened. The Russians have relied heavily on this enormous ISR strike capability, the ability to link your terrestrial platforms and space-based platforms that provide you with instantaneous intelligence, i.e. targeting data, to your various guns, artillery that is either tube artillery, rocket artillery, tactical ballistic missiles, and so forth. It may be now that the utility of Bakhmut from that standpoint has been exhausted, and the Russians may simply close it off. But as I understand it, somewhere between 7 and 10% of the urban area that is to the northwest has some Ukrainians left in it. But ultimately, as the ground dries, Bakhmut becomes important for the use of the Russians in order to move forces forward in north and west. Because if you look at the map, it's not that far from Kiev. And it's very close, frankly, in geographic terms to Kharkiv, or Kharkov. So you have Bakhmut is the new center of gravity for the Russians, if you will, in this sense. And that's where the war is headed. And as I pointed out to someone the other day, they said, well, why haven't the Russians destroyed all the bridges across the Dnieper River? Well, because they plan to use them, because those bridges will support Russian traffic. So I think we can see where things will go, but they're not going to move dramatically until the May-June timeframe. Historically, June is when you've had most of the major offensives in the region, certainly in modern times. That is since the age of Napoleon, because you're not going to get far through the sea of mud once it establishes itself. And then you have to deal with this sort of crushing winter historically. Well, we haven't had much winter by Russian standards, but we certainly have the sea of mud. So that's got to go away. Then I think we'll see dramatic movement.
Do you think that he's starting to set up a narrative that Ukraine is starting to lose this? Or is he just being honest that, hey, it's their definition and we know they're not going to meet that? Where do you think General Milley was heading with a comment like that?
Well, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and so it's not impossible that there is some measure of honesty sometimes in his remarks. As a general rule, I would write off anything the man says. He's a purely political animal who exists as a mouthpiece for the administration and ultimately will say or do whatever he's told. That's why he got the job. That's why most of these people become chairman. They don't become chairman because of any demonstrated character, competence, or intelligence. They're there because they're people that will do whatever they're told and say whatever they're told to say. So I don't think I'd pay too much attention to him. Now, having said that, if he is setting up a narrative, it's to protect himself more than anything else. I mean, that's his habit. You know, he's like everybody else that wants to be successful in Washington. You put on your Teflon suit, nothing sticks, and you shift responsibility to others and let them pay the price for accountability. Listen, I don't know that Ukraine will even exist as a nation state by the end of 2023. I think it's essentially a dead issue right now. Conditions inside Ukraine are horrific. The losses are horrific. We simply lie. We don't tell the truth. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Telegraph in England, whatever you want to pick out as a newspaper or a news outlet in the West, is assimilated the narrative that comes out of Langley and London and MI6. The Ukrainians are winning. The Ukrainians are, well, they can still win. They can still win. Well, things aren't going well, but they can still win. And eventually it'll be, we no longer have contact with anyone in Kiev. By the way, in today's other news, we're continuing to work hard to start war with China.
Yeah, why do they continue to provoke China? Is it to show dominance and hope that there's no consequences? Or what is I don't understand the action behind it.
China is a useful instrument, particularly to the armed services, especially the Navy and the Marines. It has appealed to politicians on the Hill who always act irresponsibly. They're never held accountable for anything they say or do. China, it's easy to stand up and hurl abuse at China. You know, someone the other day tried to ask one of the senators, I've forgotten who it was, who likes to talk about China as this great evil empire, about the Uyghurs. And the Uyghurs are, of course, this Turkic Muslim people. There are between 11 and 13 million of them. And they said, well, you know, the Saudis sent a delegation of clerics and governmental representatives to China and were given total support and carte blanche to visit the area where the Uyghurs live, to go into these so-called concentration camps and see what was happening. And they came back and reported that the majority of the Uyghurs that were being held in detention were Uyghurs that had returned from fighting with ISIS and were therefore judged as dangerous Islamists. The Chinese are as worried about Islamists as we are and their horrible impact on civilization. And the rest of the people that are there with them are either related to them or supportive of them insofar as they are stressing their Islamist views. The rest of the population, which is 95 to 98% of the Uyghur population, is not part of this and is therefore not involved in this. Well, the senator said, well, I know nothing about that. Well, of course he doesn't know anything about it, doesn't want to hear anything about it. It's necessary for us, as we've learned over the last several decades, to demonize whomever we fight. I mean, I could take you all the way back to the Spanish-American War, and the Spaniards were by no means horrific criminals, killing, murdering, and mistreating everyone in sight when they had an empire, and we drove them out of Cuba. We've done the same thing during the First World War. We had a population in this country that at the time, probably a third of them were at least descended from Germans. There was very little support inside the United States for war with Germany in 1914, 15, 16, 17. So what happened? Well, the British printed lots of lies about the Germans, which were readily picked up in all the Western newspapers. The banks got involved, and they produced this tremendous propaganda campaign to demonize Germans and the Kaiser. Well, that worked enough to help justify the war. Now, we all found out when it was over, the whole thing had been a travesty and a fraud, and that's why you had nothing but Republicans opposed to overseas interventions in office for the next 12 years after we finally got rid of Woodrow Wilson. My point is that this is the issue with China. We don't need, in current and future wars, this enormous, what I would call Midway Jutland fleet construct, this massive fleet of large capital ships. Those days are over. Aircraft carriers and most of these larger capital ships are only useful in what we now call essentially permissive environments, low intensity conflict. What that means is that your opponent has no means of really attacking you from ashore. Your opponent doesn't have access to modern technology, because if he does, he's going to neutralize those surface ships in short order or even sink them. And this is the problem we have with China right now. The Chinese have invested very heavily in those intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms. I mean, this goes back to the silly nonsense about the dumb balloon. The Chinese have over 30 satellites orbiting this planet. A substantial number of them have military application. They can also look down on the ground anywhere in the world and read the names on gravestones, which is what ours can do. In other words, they can also tune in and listen to what Joe Biden says to Dr. Jill at night before he goes to bed in the White House. I mean, these things exist. That raised questions about, well, if this is what you've got, what does the balloon do? It's absurd. Well, the problem we've got now in the South China Sea, all over the Pacific coast with China, is that if we try to move in with naval power at close range, and that means at least within 150 to 200 nautical miles, we're not only going to be tracked, we're going to be targeted and potentially damaged or sunk. So this is a huge problem. This is not the Imperial Japanese Navy or Air Force or Army, however. The Chinese are not massing forces anywhere to invade anyone. The Chinese are certainly not going to block the Strait of Malacca, which is absolutely vital and essential to them and the importation of oil and food, as well as a way for them to export. This is all nonsense. We keep saying, well, the Chinese are bullying their neighbors. Well, they've had some disputes with the Vietnamese with fishing boats, and the Vietnamese promptly sent them on their way and effectively threatened the Chinese with military action. Well, the Chinese left. And there was so much resentment and hatred of Chinese a few years ago in Vietnam that ultimately the leadership of Vietnam had to ask Mr. Xi, who is the de facto emperor of China, to remove his Chinese citizens from Vietnam. Chinese planes and ships showed up and pulled all the Chinese out. Then the Vietnamese proceeded to burn Chinese factories. Was there a war with Vietnam? No. Chinese are not interested in war. From the Chinese vantage point, conflict is very bad for business. So what's their focus? Well, they say, well, the Chinese are trying to conquer all of Asia. No, they're trying to build a commercial system that allows them to trade with everybody on the Eurasian continent. That means everyone from France to Tokyo. That means everyone from Beijing all the way down to Riyadh or Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula. They want to build the rail lines, the terminals. Now, this is an enormous undertaking, and we have decided that this is threatening to us. And the only threat that I can see that it presents is the threat of commercial competition, because if they can succeed across Central Asia to Europe, that suddenly reduces their dependence on the sea. And you see, our only trump card in this competition militarily really is the submarine fleet, because we have the capacity to stop everything going in or coming out of China. And that's another reason why the Chinese are doubling down on building this new commercial construct. And they've got lots of willing participants, because Iran and India, even Pakistan, along with all the Central Asian republics, now Turkey, the Europeans, everybody's become very sick and tired of us. And they don't particularly care for us to tell them that they may not trade with China. Yeah. And so that's what they're going to do.